Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Here we are in 2019. Wasn't it just a couple of days ago we were all sitting around waiting for December 21st, 2012 to arrive so the Mayan calendar prediction could bring about the end of the world or something like that? All those experts that wrote all those books and went on all those talk shows talking about the end of the world, and you haven't heard a squeak out of any of them since. I guess that should go to show if you're going to predict something, you might want to do a little more research or something. Anyway, tonight we're going to be talking about the Hutchison Effect. And, of course, the show was requested by Watches 1000. Lots of requests coming in from there. Wonder what he or she looks like. Hear from them all the time, but since this is the internet, you never actually get to see these people, so... well. New inventions. Where do they come from? I know there are inventors out there, but just stop and think. How do you come up with an idea that no one has ever thought of before? In ancient Greece, ideas were thought to come from the muse. There were 9 daughters of the Greek god Zeus. Clio was the muse who discovered history and the guitar. What a combination. History was named Clio in the ancient years because it referred to Kleos, the Greek word for heroic acts. Clio was always represented with a clarion in the right arm and a book in her left hand. Euterpe, I think that's how it's pronounced, discovered several musical instruments, and as well as dialects. She was always depicted holding a flute, while many instruments were always around her. Thalia was the protector of comedy. I didn't know comedy needed to be protected, but maybe back then it was an issue. She discovered comedy, geometry, architectural science, and agriculture. I guess being a farmer was considered humorous, maybe. Or maybe you were supposed to laugh while you were working on architectural drawings or something. She was also the protector of symposiums. She was always depicted holding a theatrical comedy mask. That's the mask with the smiling face. Melpomene was the opposite of Thalia. She was the protector of tragedy. She invented tragedy, rhetoric, speech, and melos. I'm not too sure what melos is, some kind of a feeling. She was depicted holding the tragedy mask, which is the one with the frowning face. And she had a bat. Therpiscore was the protector of dance. No wonder I don't like dance. She also invented the harp and education, which explains why my wife, who is a school teacher, also likes to dance. She was depicted wearing laurels on her head and holding a harp and dancing. Erato was the protector of love and poetry, as well as weddings. Her name comes from the Greek word eros that refers to feelings of falling in love. She was depicted holding a lyre, that's like a harp, and she had arrows and a bow, kind of like Cupid. Polymnia was the protector of the divine hymns and mimicked art. I guess that's where mimes came from. She invented geometry and grammar. Urania was the protector of celestial objects and stars, like the constellations and the moons and planets. She invented astronomy. She was always depicted bearing stars. Calliope was the superior muse, as she was accompanying kings and princes in order to impose justice and serenity. She was the protector of heroic poems and rhetoric art. According to myth, Homer asked for Calliope to inspire him while writing the Iliad and the Odyssey. I always like to say that my muse is not amused. When I sit down at my computer and try to write one of my books, I sometimes find my mind a total blank. The Greeks would say my muse was not with me. On other occasions, I've found the words flowing from my fingers without a whole lot of interference from my brain. Dean Koontz was interviewed on Coast to Coast one night. I listened to the show several times because, well, I like his books. Dean said when he writes a book, he only has the opening lines to begin with. He is just as surprised by how the story turns out as we are. I thought this was weird until I began writing. It's as if the book is writing itself sometimes. Now, that's what I like about fiction. You just sit at the computer and the words flow out. Well, my latest book is non-fiction. You talk about a lot of work. I spend days reading old newspapers and books and articles about Fort McIntosh here in Laredo. I talk to people who have had experiences while out at the old fort. I've been working on this project since October, and I still have a long ways to go. If perchance you ever attended classes at Laredo Junior College, Laredo Community College, or just the Laredo College, or perhaps you spent some time out at the old fort just driving around and looking, and you had any kind of a otherworldly experience, doesn't even have to really be paranormal, just something you can't explain, send me a note and I'll put it in the book. You can send it to strangethings@arkanasa.com. I'll make it sound good and send you back the draft so you can make any corrections, but let me know if you got anything you'd like to add to the book. There are folks who can come up with inventions by sitting at their desk and thinking. Let's just say you wanted to invent a means to see in the dark. I know night vision is here. I used it all the time. But how did the first inventor come up with the first night vision scope? At first, all they could do was make the image bigger so you could pick out things at night. Binoculars or a telescope. Then somebody said, hey, let's use some image intensifier to make seeing in the dark easier. Well, how did he or she think of this? According to Colonel Corso, the night vision technology came about shortly after the Roswell UFO crash. If you want to read about it, you can check out the book, The Day After Roswell by Colonel Corso. Pretty interesting reading. Then, when you're trying to invent something, you're going to have a lot of trial and error. Usually a lot more error than outcome. A lot of mistakes had to be made before a working device could be put out there for people to use. This, coupled with the problem of dealing with people who said what you're trying to do was just plain crazy. Until the Wright brothers took to the skies, people said human flight was impossible. Then, when the brothers got off the ground, people said Okay, fine, you flew, but it's a total waste of time because nothing useful will ever come from it. When an inventor had a good idea that would benefit folks, but it was costly to work on, they would have to go looking for investors. First, you'd have to convince somebody what you were trying to do was in fact doable. Then you'd have to show how the invention and the investors would not only get their money back, but make a profit from their return. A lot of folks with money to invest in things like that want to control the project from the beginning all the way to the trip to the bank. You have inventors who come up with things to make money, and you have inventors who come up with things just because it didn't exist until now. Then there are those driven who are trying to make the world a better place. Some of the best inventions, for example, anesthesia, is considered one of the top inventions. Without it, operations would be hard on patients. The trouble is, some folks are wandering around in a state of anesthesia all the time. Too many folks are using analgesics all the time, and this is a form of anesthesia. The printing press is right up there in the top 5. Without the printing press, books would never have been invented. The book is the best way of passing on ideas. Okay, well, it was already invented, but they're all handwritten, and it took forever to get a copy of a book made. Far better than the computer, because a book works all the time, whether you have any power or not. There's no battery, and they're relatively inexpensive. In my den, where I broadcast from, is a set of bookshelves that go from one end of the room to the other, which is about 16 feet, from floor to ceiling, and it's solid books. I like books. The electric light bulb is a great invention. Without it, it would be hard to read at night. This is the fact the electric light bulb has led to many other inventions. And seeing in the dark has made the 12-hour day into a 24-hour day. Things can be done any time of the day or night. Vaccines are considered to be a great invention. The problem I have with them is, to begin with, the drug companies use a mercury substance as a preservative. Even after the CDC said the mercury preservatives were bad for people, drug companies continue using them today. Thimerosal is cheap and readily available, so they just keep squirting it into people's arms. A lot of people think that because of the CDC's ruling that they don't use thimerosal anymore, but the truth of the matter is they're still putting it in there. Perhaps they've changed the name, but it's still mercury. Then there's the little thing about cost. A drug company can take a 10-cent product and sell it for hundreds of dollars. They say they need the money to create new drugs for diseases that we don't even have yet. I haven't had a flu shot in over 10 years. And I haven't had the flu in over 10 years. If you want to hear more about this, check out A Little Problem with Big Pharma, June 4th, 2018, for more on this. The airplane is a great invention. Too bad the TSA has thoroughly screwed air travel up. I haven't flown since that trip to California. I was flying courtesy of the United States Border Patrol. It was just after 9/11, and I was flying armed. I showed my badge to the ticket agent and was passed through security. I got on the plane and flew to California with a 4-hour delay sitting on the runway in Dallas. We sat on the plane waiting for our turn to take off. It was a 3.5-hour flight. Once I arrived in the Granola State, I had to leave the terminal and then re-enter through a different building. That's why they call it LAX. No biggie. I walked up to the woman at the X-ray machine. I showed her my ID. She instructed me to go through a door and around the security checkpoint. As I was heading to the end of the checkpoint, a guy in a blue jacket, who needed more exercise and less carbs, stopped me saying I wasn't allowed in this part of the security area. I showed him my government ID, at which point it got weird. He told me to go through the security checkpoint. I told him okay, but I'd set off the alarm since I was flying armed. He got all kinds of worried as to why I was flying with my sidearm. I showed him my credentials again. I even looked at my credentials to make sure that that's what I was showing him. Well, he still couldn't quite seem to realize that I was there on official business, and you could see that his eyes weren't focusing on anything other than the air between us. After a long pause, he told me to go through the checkpoint anyway. I returned to the front of the security station and once more was told to go around. I explained what the TSA guy had said, and so the woman in charge of the X-ray machine went over to him, and a long, drawn-out discussion ensued. After a lot of arm waving and back and forth, the woman came back with a look of embarrassment on her face. She said I could walk around the security station, but my carry-on bag had to be x-rayed. Well, by this time I was fed up, so I plopped my bag down on the conveyor belt and I ran to the other end so I could watch the upcoming show. Inside my carry-on were all the things I needed while on duty. Things like extra magazines for my pistol, boxes of bullets, my two-way radio, my baton, a knife, flashlight, batteries, and since I was a paramedic, I had all my tools for fixing injuries in there as well. There's scissors and a scalpel and all kinds of sharp, pointy things. All the things I didn't want in my checked luggage because checked luggage had a tendency to disappear, and I really didn't want to have to replace all these expensive items. As my bag slipped into the X-ray machine, the guy running it almost fell out of his chair. He had no idea what was going on. It looked like a terrorist was about to board the plane, and remember 9/11 was just a few months past. I finally cleared security with the overwhelming feeling if these clowns were in charge of security, we were all doomed. The funny thing is, this was not the end of my ordeal. After spending so much time trying to get through security, I really had to use the facilities. I nipped into the men's room, and as I was standing there doing what I had to do, and the bathroom door banged open, and 3 airport police came in. One asked me if I was smoking in the bathroom. No kidding. He had his hand on the butt of his weapon. I said no, I was not smoking, and you couldn't even smell any smoke in the room. He looked at me as if I might be lying. The 3 officers proceeded to search the tiny room as if looking for an armed assailant. I guess smoking is considered a capital crime out there. I wound up missing my connecting flight to El Centro. I didn't want to wait until the next day, seeing as there was only 1 flight per day, so I went downstairs and rented a car to drive to my destination. It wasn't 5 minutes after I'd arrived in California that I was saying to myself, I want to go back to Texas. I much preferred the first time I flew into California. I was carrying an M16 rifle. We flew in on a C-140, and it was cold and noisy, but I didn't have to deal with TSA. Yep, the airplane is a great invention as long as you can avoid any contact with TSA, which is impossible. And we all know that TSA stands for thousands standing around. My all-time favorite invention is not so much a device as a drink. I'm talking about coffee. Yes, coffee is an absolute greatest invention. Coffee took man out of the Middle Ages and into the Industrial Revolution. Coffee helped lead to the American Revolution. Think about it. If you want to create a successful revolution, you don't want to be hanging out in a bar. Everyone will wind up drunk or hungover, and somebody is going to say the wrong thing to the right person. Yes, coffee, the thing dreams is made of. And now, let's take a look at a man who wants to make the world a better place. John Hutchison was born on October 19th, 1945, in Canada. He attended the North Shore High School up until the 8th grade, and then he received private tutoring for the next 3 years. You can find a lot of information on just about everything by searching the internet. I tried, but I could find very little on John's early life. Maybe there just wasn't anything there to be told, or maybe somebody didn't want us to know. In 1955, John showed an early interest in electronics, chemistry, radio transmissions, and astronomy. His first experiment in chemistry was in 1959 when he tried fabrication of his own cannons and guns. My kind of kid. He was 14 years old building his own cannon. 1968, he produced 3 small free energy units with no input, but they were putting out 10 volts at 500 milliamps. Now, I know that's not a lot of energy, but considering there was nothing going in, this was a plus. John had a sense of humor that some might find kind of strange. One day, he put together a bunch of hydrogen balloons, and he released them over the city. People seeing them thought it was some kind of an alien invasion. It was covered on the news, and it caused quite a stir throughout the city. 1969, John worked at the Riverview Hospital as a janitor. He was big into firearms, and he opened a gun museum in Vancouver. When gun ownership laws were changed in Canada, John went to court and fought for his right to own firearms. He won, and the laws had to be changed once more. Now, you can own a gun in Canada, but it has to be registered, just like in Germany in the 1930s. This is a sneaky way for the government to keep track of all guns, so if they ever decide to become a dictatorship, all they have to do is knock down some people's doors at 2 o'clock in the morning. Every time a government wants to infringe on the rights of people, they always put in words like, for the good of the people, or common sense regulations. This was also what they did in Germany in the 1930s. We all know how that turned out. John Hutchison also had a very big interest in electronics. Standing 6.5 feet tall, he's easy to spot in a crowd. He lived in an apartment that was easy to find just by walking down the street. The balcony was overflowing with parts salvaged from ships and submarines. It looked like a science fiction movie set. A lot of his electric equipment came from military salvage. It was so crowded with electric gadgets, there was no room to do much other than stand in a crouching position. His living room looked more like the inside of a submarine. John Hutchison has been featured in over 300 TV shows and well over 1,000 radio shows. He's easy to listen to and doesn't use too many big scientific words, but some of what he says is impossible to follow because he's referring to things that the rest of us don't usually talk about. 1978, John's apartment was searched and all of his antique handguns were seized. No reason was given, only that the weapons were thought to be illegal. Well, John went to court and he sued the government. He won the case, but it took 2 years before his personal property was returned to him. This sounds like more of a harassment move than a justifiable search and seizure. A zero-point energy. It sounds kind of neat while at the same time confusing. I'll try to translate this into my form of English. The way I see it, a zero-point energy is being able to get out more energy than is put in. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be changed. Let's try that again. You eat a meal and then use the energy from the food to do work. You can only work as long as you take in enough fuel to do the job. And there is the waste product. And sometimes there's a waistline product as well. Wrong food. The idea of zero-point energy is to get more energy out of a device than the fuel put into it. A perpetual motion device would be 0 point. Nikola Tesla believed there was energy in the atmosphere and all you needed to do was harness it and you'd have free power. You'd get out far more energy than you put into it. Tesla had an electric-powered Pierce Arrow automobile back in the 1930s. The internal combustion engine was replaced with an electric motor. The power source feeding energy into the motor was a black box full of radio tubes, which was in the glove compartment. Those of y'all old enough are familiar with the old radios and TVs that had vacuum tubes in them. Each tube had its special job, and when things stopped working, you had to replace a tube or two. Well, the box Tesla had also had an antenna that stuck up into the air. Tesla would tune the device to the proper frequency, and this would send power or energy to the car's motor. The car was nearly silent. It just kind of hummed as it was being driven. Tesla drove the car around on several occasions. Well, actually, he had a driver who did the actual driving. Tesla had never bothered to learn how to drive a car. When not in use, the car was stashed in a barn somewhere near Niagara Falls, and at some point in time it disappeared. Today, nobody knows where the car is, but they do know that it existed. Tesla was sending energy from the power plant at Niagara Falls to his car. The big plan was to build a series of gigantic antennae that would draw the energy from the atmosphere and then distribute this power to everyone on the planet. The experiment was going to be costly. In today's world, it would have run into the billions of dollars. In order to build his experimental antenna, Tesla went to J.P. Morgan and was given a promissory note for over half of the money needed. Well, then, Tesla sunk all of his own capital into building the first power sending unit at Montauk, New York. The project was called Wardenclyffe. There's something odd about Montauk. A lot of strange things keep happening in that neck of the woods. When Tesla ran out of his own money, he asked Morgan to send the money that had been promised. Well, Morgan never responded. Tesla kept writing to Morgan asking for the money to finish the project. Well, actually, Morgan didn't want Tesla to succeed because how do you charge people for energy that is coming down from the sky? Where do you put the meter? Tesla wanted to make a better world for everybody, while Morgan just wanted to make money for himself. Tesla soldiered on and continued with his energy-sending device. During one trial in 1908, Tesla said he sent a bolt of energy halfway around the world. It came down in Siberia, an area known today as Tunguska. About 60 million trees were destroyed over a 2,150 square mile area. Now, we don't know for a fact that Tesla was responsible for Tunguska incident, but he did say he was sorry for doing it. Had Tesla succeeded with his energy broadcasting network, just think how different the world would be today. How much money do you spend on just electricity and fuel for your car? I'd guesstimate about $500 a month. But then again, those folks who became enormously wealthy by selling us oil and electricity would all have been looking for jobs in other fields. People like John Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and all the other barons of industry would have been just regular folks today. With that, we're going to take a brief pause, play a couple commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Truck. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. Are you taking care of your skin, or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. John Hutchison set about trying to create zero-point energy by rebuilding Tesla's equipment piece by piece. He wound his own coils, and he made his own capacitors, and he studied the period machinery of Tesla's day. Not having a billionaire sponsor, John had to get by with donations and looking for the cheapest equipment possible. Army surplus. When at long last John thought he had the equipment right, he flipped a switch. Instead of sending electricity from point A to point B, he got what became known as the Hutchison Effect. While playing with his gadgets, Hutchison found a metal bar he was using began to melt. The bar looked more like a stick of butter in a microwave. It collapsed in on itself. You can watch this video on YouTube by searching Hutchison Effect. It is a mind-boggling video. The bar of metal smoked as if it were on fire, which is really weird for metal. Bits and pieces flaked off, but it was not hot to the touch. So how was John able to melt iron without any heat? This was what a lot of scientists wanted to know. John was using ultra-high frequency electromagnetic waves to affect the iron bar. In another experiment, John managed to get a bunch of different objects made from everything from metal to glass to move about on a smooth surface by passing an electromagnetic wand over them. To show his humor, John had a small troll doll sitting in the display. Then John got things to float up off the table. The items were mostly metal, of some kind. By adjusting the magnetic waves, he could cancel out gravity. Well, if you read the comments, you'll see some folks are amazed while others go out of their way to try to debunk his work. Saying things like the camera was upside down and the items all just fell down instead of up. This doesn't work if you look close. The objects don't fall away from the table, they float up off of it. Even though John was working with magnetic fields, he was able to levitate non-metallic items. Things like wood and plastic all floated about as if weightless. A lot of folks think just because they have an opinion, the rest of us want to hear it. Not really. I have lots of opinions that I keep to myself because I'm smart enough to know that I don't know everything. Watch the video closely and then try to figure out how the objects are affected. Someone even went to the bother of turning the video upside down to show how the objects were being moved. How do you glue a cannonball to a piece of wood so that it slowly lets go? There are no strings of glue on the video. I watched both videos several times. Upside down, the video just looks like it's upside down. John Hutchison didn't make these videos to put on YouTube, to try to impress people. He had filmed his experiments to show to other scientists so they would become interested and continue in John's work. If the experiments were nothing more than a bunch of faked videos, then why was the United States military interested in John's work? By 1983, the U.S. government began showing an interest in what John was doing. There was a demonstration of the Hutchison Effect to the U.S. Army Intelligence Unit, as well as the Los Alamos Laboratory, which led to further interest in his work. One demonstration was videotaped by Los Alamos and others and then shared with other U.S. scientists. Metal samples taken from laboratory analysis were studied in their own labs. After looking at the bits of metal for many months, no test results were ever released. Either they couldn't figure it out, or they discovered there was something going on that should be kept away from the public. 1984, there was a demonstration at Washington State University and Fort Worth Army Command in Texas. 1985, demonstration was at McDonnell Douglas Corporation in cooperation with the Los Alamos Laboratories and the U.S. Army Intelligence. By 1986, the Canadian Scientific and Technical Intelligence Agency began to investigate the Hutchison Effect. North American and European laboratories indicated there were some results of atomic changes in the samples they had taken. 1989, John Hutchison was invited by European scientists to come to Austria and Germany. During a 2-year period, there were new discoveries in subatomic physics and eliminations of radioactivity. There followed a worldwide effort to offer John research partnerships from countries wanting him to continue his experiments, but with the understanding that the results would belong to whichever country he was working for. John rejected all of these offers, saying that they were his ideas and that he should own them. John Hutchison did make a deal with the German government and began to make arrangements to move his 22-ton laboratory from Canada. With such a massive amount of equipment and having it go from one side of the world to the other, John stepped back and let others do all the work. When the lab was supposed to be shipped to the folks in charge, they said that there was nothing in it but a bunch of 55-gallon barrels of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which were used in electronics and that are highly toxic. The big question was, what happened to all of the electronic equipment in the lab? 22 tons of electronics vanished into someone's domain. In 1990, the Canadian government raided John's lab while he was out of the country attending conferences and experiments in Europe. The lab was searched and just about everything was seized under the cover of national security. None of the men in dark suits who entered the lab ever showed any identification, and they never showed a warrant to search or seize anything. When John tried to get his lab back, and he went before the judge to do so. Even when found in the wrong, the government refused to return any of the lab equipment they had taken. They simply ignored the judge and said, "National security." The German deal fell through, and John was forced to begin rebuilding his lab from scratch. On Saturday, March 18, 2000, while conducting some levitation experiments in his apartment, John was recording what he was doing when, in the background, you could hear the sound of approaching sirens. Then there was a phone call from somebody stating they were the police, and John was ordered to open his front door. Well, then, John said he opened the door to find a group of 10 or so men, some in uniform. They were all carrying guns. They entered his apartment, handcuffed John, and took him outside. He sat on the front steps while his apartment was searched. The men in suits never showed any form of ID stating who they were with. After a thorough search of the building, an electronics expert was brought in. John was kept outside while all the equipment in his building was being photographed. Once the authorities had finished, they told John that the raid was conducted because somebody had called saying he was bringing illegal firearms into his apartment. If the authorities were looking for firearms, what were all those photographs for? John was left to speculate as to why the raid was conducted and how the authorities knew he was conducting a levitation experiment. He came to the conclusion that his neighbors might have gotten wind of what he was doing if perhaps something in their apartment was being affected by his electronic equipment. Maybe things were flying off the shelves and the neighbors all blamed John. Additionally, those individuals dressed in suits were brought in who had taken extensive photographs of the Hutchison apparatus. Hutchison indicates that these people had an official air about them, and that they might be government agents, especially given the confiscation of the original Hutchison lab, which had taken place while he was out of the country in '90. None of these people showed any identification. Those who have followed John's career of invention and innovation will recall that his first lab had been seized by the Canadian government under the direction of the former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The government has retained the lab in spite of a court order by a judge saying that they were to return it. After many more years of experiments, demonstrations, and lectures in other countries, John returned to Vancouver in '91. He built his apartment lab from surplus Navy equipment. There was so much electronic equipment hanging from the balcony, the apartment was easy to find. It became a landmark in New Westminster, British Columbia. After years of work and scrounging, John had built the apartment laboratory, and he was back in business. He used whatever money he could find, either through donations or by working on research jobs, to then buy surplus electronic equipment from the government. The hard part was figuring out how to wire everything together and then get it to work again. He used surplus generators to create more energy so his power bills weren't so high. Well, John also looked into the Bermuda Triangle. He came up with an unusual theory that the triangle was a black hole that is connected to the Dragon's Triangle on the other side of the planet. Boats, ships, and planes that vanish from the Bermuda Triangle wind up passing through the black hole and wind up at the bottom of the ocean just south of Japan. John was interviewed on a TV documentary, and that was when I heard this story. The scientists agree mostly that the pyramids in Giza took something like 20 years to build. They also say there are 2.3 million blocks in the Great Pyramid, and each of these blocks weighs several tons. That would mean that the Egyptians laid 1,150,000 blocks a year. To do this, they would have to quarry, move, lift, and set 3,150 blocks every day. That's 131 blocks per hour. 2 blocks were being set every minute. Kind of boggles the mind. John Hutchison came up with the theory that the Egyptians were using some form of harmonics or sound to move these blocks. He talked about something called the Rife machine, which was invented by Royal Raymond Rife, who was an American inventor who lived from 1888 until 1971. Rife had invented a microscope that was supposed to not only magnify things, but it sent out a beam that would destroy pathogens. The machine would kill cancer cells. As the machine was being used, it gave out vibrations that would cause movement in objects around it. John believed the ancient Egyptians had built a device similar to the Rife machine, and they used the vibrations or the harmonics to move the huge blocks of stone. Instead of thousands of men all dragging these blocks into place, 1 or 2 men could push the block along as the machine caused it to become nearly weightless. You can read the entire report at the HutchisonEffect.com and then click on Egyptian Technology in blue, which is halfway down the page. It's his words, so I'm not going to read it, but you can find it there if you want to read the whole thing. If you're like me, you're going to have to look up some of the things John references, since he was talking about other people's inventions as well as his own. John Hutchison was a follower of Nikola Tesla. He read as many papers and articles as he could find on the man. A 1934 New York Times article on the topic of Nikola Tesla's death ray said that the weapon would send a particle beam through the air. It was going to be so powerful that it could take out up to 10,000 airplanes from 250 miles away. Tesla envisioned a world where every country was protected by his death ray, making war impractical. Of course, people would have just come up with other ways to fight, or simply annihilated each other with the Tesla death ray. But the idea was born. Tesla simply needed to build it and find somebody to pay for it. See, Tesla hated war, and so he tried to create a weapon so powerful it would make war unfeasible. Any country starting a war would be eliminated immediately by their opponents. The machine gun was invented to make war impossible. The machine gun would kill so many soldiers that no country would ever consider starting a war. Are you seeing a pattern here? So if Nikola Tesla was able to design a death ray, John Hutchison should be able to figure out how it was designed and then build one himself. Did this ever happen? Well, John isn't really saying, but there are those who say the World Trade Center was brought down using some kind of a ray or an energy weapon. When Tesla died in 1943, the Federal Bureau of Investigation ordered the alien property custodian to seize Tesla's belongings. Why was this done? Nikola Tesla was an American citizen. He had naturalized in July 30th, 1891 at the age of 35. So why did the FBI think it was necessary to take all of his papers away and keep them hidden for years? All of Nikola Tesla's papers were later released to his nephew, Sava Kosinovich. 1952, following pressure from Tesla's nephew, Tesla's entire estate was shipped to Belgrade in 80 trunks. 1957, Tesla's ashes were shipped from the United States to Belgrade as well. But Tesla wasn't a United States citizen. Why were all of his belongings sent to a foreign country? Maybe it was to keep people like John Hutchison from being able to read them. Had the papers stayed in the United States, there were legal actions that could be taken to gain access to them. Being in a different and foreign country would make reading the papers a lot harder for anyone. One of Tesla's experiments was making a naval vessel invisible. On October 28, 1943, the USS Eldridge left its dock and made way to the middle of the Delaware River. Escort ships took up their places to watch. At the given time, the crewman responsible flipped the switch that sent electricity around the hull of the ship to see what might happen. The men watching from a safe distance all watched as the Eldridge vanished. At first, they all believed the experiment had been successful. The ship was invisible. But after close observation, they discovered not only could they not see the vessel, it was gone. The water, where the Eldridge was supposed to be, should have shown a displacement as it made contact with the sides. There should have been some indication that the ship was still there, but there was nothing. There was no way to communicate with the crew on board the missing ship. The magnetic field was interfering with radio transmissions. It took 4 hours before the Eldridge came back. It appeared in the same place as it had been. When the escort vessels all moved in to check on the crew, Once they were able to board the ship, they discovered a disturbing scene. Crewmen who had been stationed along the rails were laying on the deck. As the boarding party moved about checking on the Eldridge crew, they found some had actually become fused with the ship. Their bodies were sticking through the metal of the hull or the sides of the superstructure. Some were in intense pain, while others had passed out or been killed by having major portions of their anatomy become part steel. Some of the men had been driven insane by their experience. They ran about the deck screaming or crawling away from the rescue party. The crewmen stationed below decks were in relatively good shape. Only one man was found to be moving between visibility and invisibility. He would come and go from sight. A head count showed they were missing a lot of the crew. The Navy immediately clamped the lid on the entire area. There was a war on. All the folks in charge had to do was say, "This is now top secret," talk about it, and get charged with treason. In wartime, you get shot for this. Those sailors still salvageable were removed from the ship and taken to the naval hospital. From there, they were secretly moved to locations around the country where they could be kept away from the public. Relatives were all informed that their sons, husbands, and fathers were missing in action while at sea. Some of the crew had simply vanished. A search of the ship found far fewer on board than the roster called for. These were chalked up to having either fallen overboard or jumped. Later that day, a report came from Norfolk that a mysterious Navy vessel had appeared in the harbor. It sat there for long enough for people to look at it and see it for what it was, and then it vanished. Norfolk, Virginia is 270 miles from Philadelphia Navy Yard. This became known as the Philadelphia Experiment. In the 1980s, John was able to make a bar of metal disappear and then reappear in another location. He did this several times. John was able to teleport or transport things just like in Star Trek. By 2006, John Hutchison was trying to recreate the Philadelphia Experiment. Good thing he was working at a much smaller scale. Instead of using a Navy vessel, John was using a model battleship. So far, the model hasn't vanished or gone anywhere, but John is just getting started. The mayor of New Westminster forced John to cease operations in his lab in 2006. In 2010, John was forcibly removed by order of the mayor, who directed the fire marshal to remove him from his famous apartment lab on Fifth Avenue. John found himself without a home or a lab. He never gave up on his zero-point energy experiments. Instead of trying to create a huge power source, John decided to try making smaller, easier-to-build power containers. He began looking into crystals. John tried mixing crushed crystals with various types of metals to see if he could draw power from the crystals and create free energy. This would be in the form of a battery that never needed recharging. The prototype was big, several feet long, but then the first computers were as big as a house. Now you have one in your pocket. With enough time and resources, John should be able to make these batteries small enough to be used in all types of devices. What else has John been doing? How about experimenting with mushrooms? No, not the magic mushrooms. He's trying to come up with a new form of mushroom soup? No, just think about it. Mushrooms grow on just about anything. Fungus. John got to wondering what would happen if he zapped mushrooms with electricity. And so he did. The mushrooms began to grow at an accelerated rate. So what can you do with giant, fast-growing mushrooms? John wanted to try using the mushrooms to suck up oil spills. When an oil pipeline or tanker has an accident, it would help if fast-growing, oil-eating mushrooms could be dropped on the oil slick. The mushrooms would do away with the oil while doing away with the use of chemical dispersants as well. This would be a safe and cheap answer to oil spills. Today, John has a new laboratory. It is built inside an old converted bus. He calls it the SWATT bus. He's spending his time in the United States driving around and conducting more experiments. Just like Nikola Tesla, John has made a lot of money and then lost all of it to shady partners and crooked business deals. Someday soon, I hope to see some of his inventions on shelves at stores. A Hutchison generator would be nice on camping trips or during power outages. How about a Hutchison car that runs on electricity coming down from the sky? See, the trouble with the Tesla automobile, the electric car that they built, you still have to plug it in. You still have to make electricity from burning coal in order to run a Tesla electric car. Some odd reason people fail to understand that part. If John Hutchison is a fake, well, I don't think so. Just look at who his detractors are. Most of them hide behind the anonymity of the internet. The government is way too interested in his work for it all to be just smoke and mirrors. If you'd like to watch some of his experiments, just go to YouTube and search for the Hutchison Effect. If you have some cash laying around the house that needs a good home, John is accepting donations through PayPal. You can write to John at info@hutchisoneffect.ca. I hope this show was up to the standards. If you like it, tell your friends. Heck, tell everybody, even if you don't know who they are. I could use the listeners. Watches 1000 asked for tonight's show. The archives are mostly at YouTube now, but their last few years are still at strangethings.podomatic.com. You can also listen on Stitcher, iTunes, and a bunch of other places. If you want to contact me, I can be reached at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James with Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?